Hi, I'm Mimi Geerges. The FBI says hundreds, if not thousands, of Americans are ISIS sympathizers. We'll talk about ISIS in America, who's joining, and what's the draw.
There is a large pool of people out there in this country who are sympathetic towards ISIS. They get drawn in, and once they see the world differently, they see America as this enemy. Within that pool, there are people who will one day make the next step.
Welcome to the Mimi Geerges Show. Since the rise of the Islamic State, the number of Americans supporting or expressing admiration for ISIS has been unprecedented. The FBI says there are currently 900 ISIS-related investigations in all 50 states. Some of them travel or try to travel to Syria to join ISIS, while some of them intend to plan and carry out attacks in this country. A report from the George Washington University Program on Extremism looks at how ISIS recruits supporters among American Muslims. Alex Hitchens is research director at GW's Program on Extremism and has studied how terrorist groups attract recruits. Alex, welcome.
Thank you.
So every deadly terrorist attack in the U.S. after 9/11 has been carried out by American citizens or permanent residents. What's the draw of this ideology that tells Americans they should be killing other Americans?
Well, what we've seen is, particularly since 9/11 and really over the last decade, a very concerted effort to essentially westernize jihadist ideology and make it relevant to the experiences of American Muslims and other Americans who are looking for sort of other ways of understanding their identity, that, you know, guys who are on the fringes of their societies, people who are trying to understand their situations. And this ideology helps to tell them, okay, you see, your personal problems, this is actually can be linked to a wider conspiracy, say, against Islam, a sort of Western conspiracy to destroy your religion and your fellow, Muslims. So what they've been able to do is latch on to this ideology in a way that they weren't perhaps able to before. It offers them new identities, new social circles, new ways of understanding their role in the world, and sort of gives their life a new meaning.
So I understand that there are definitely people that are just kind of troubled or that are looking for something, but some of these people are very well adjusted. They have bright futures ahead of them. They have a good socioeconomic status in this country. How could they be drawn to this?
Yeah, I mean, there is no one profile. And yeah, while there are a lot of people who are on the fringes of society who do this, there are a lot of people who have seemingly great lives. And again, these are people who are more looking for that sense of adventure, who have really totally bought into the ideology, who believe that, jihadism is the most accurate representation of their religion, and that if they don't follow it to the full, they are not properly, practicing Islam. And unfortunately, they've been convinced of that by various scholars and other propagandists within the movement.
So let's talk about the people that have been charged. So far, 109 individuals here in this country have been charged with ISIS-related offenses. 30% of those are charged or they're accused of being involved in plots to carry out here in the U.S. What are some of those plots? What have we been seeing plans for?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the most recent would probably be Ahmed Rahimi, who tried to detonate explosives in New York and New Jersey. He was, again, inspired by Baghdadi and ISIS. We also saw the Garland shooting in Texas, the two men, Elton Simpson and Nadir Sufi, who actually nearly carried out a shooting at an event there about the Prophet Muhammad and cartoons about him. They attempted to carry out an attack at this event in Garland, Texas. They were stopped on their way. Again, these were guys who were inspired by ISIS and by their involvement on sort of ISIS Twitter networks.
So let's talk about Twitter for a minute, because the study really does look at Twitter in particular. Why Twitter? Why has it been specifically successful?
There's a couple of sort of things about Twitter that make it quite a useful tool for ISIS. One, it's very difficult to regulate it. So even if you shut down accounts that are pro-ISIS, that encourage people to take part in terrorist attacks, they can very easily pop back up. And that's the sort of the whack-a-mole effect of the Twitter sphere. The other problem is it creates a sort of echo chamber. So even in the real world, extremist organizations, particularly jihadist organizations, rely on getting their recruits and closing them off from the rest of the world, closing them off from dissenting voices, people who might turn them the other way, and in fact getting them closer and closer into a tightly knit group of friends who think only one way. unfortunately, Twitter and other social media platforms really kind of offer that exact same thing. You know, you use Twitter, I use Twitter, and we realize that it tailors itself to our interests. And this is exactly, you know, this is the nature of social media. This is not something we can do too much about. But unfortunately, it also is very helpful to organizations who are trying to close people off. And so a lot of these guys, they start getting involved in this world, and before they know it, it's all they're hearing. And it sort of amplifies all the wrong voices and diminishes the kind of voice that may turn them, you know, turn them against those beliefs.
There's the report identifies something called shout-out accounts on Twitter. What does that mean?
So essentially, we've divided ISIS Twitter use into 3 categories. The first are the nodes, and so these are the guys who create new material. They create new propaganda and they put it out there. The second are the amplifiers. These are the guys who essentially retweet and favorite all that stuff and get it around the network. And they don't really create their own material, but they help to popularize the material created by the nodes. And finally, we have the shout-outs, who are the guys who kind of help with the situation of getting, so a lot of the major accounts get shut down and they start up again. They need people to draw attention to those new accounts to the existing network, and that's what the shout-outs do. They'll say, okay, here's this this guy here. You know, he was known under this handle. He's just come back under this one. Everybody go follow him. So they help to sort of redirect people's attention to the new accounts after they've been shut down.
So as you said, it really doesn't help that Twitter's shutting down accounts, because they come back out and they use it as a badge of honor. Look, Twitter shut me down.
Yes, but we have also found in recent research that while there is this whack-a-mole problem, accounts that are shut down and come back tend to have diminishing returns as they return. So every time they come back, their influence is less, their followers are less. So there is some impact there on having those kind of hard measures, but it certainly isn't going to be the only way to deal with it.
Are ISIS supporters targeting African Americans in particular?
I wouldn't say they are particularly targeting any specific ethnic group. They will, of course, try and play on people's feelings of marginalization.
Because they had gotten involved in Black Lives Matter, tweeting about that.
Yes, because really, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement could be used against people who are sort of against American values. They can sort of use that, you know, and sort of misuse it, misrepresent it, and say, okay, you see, America's broken. America says it's the country of tolerance and unity, but actually you see that, you know, this minority in America actually doesn't have a fair shot. And so it's kind of trying to make people turn away from American values and taking advantage of a movement and sort of manipulating a sort of a legitimate movement.
So over half of people arrested for ISIS-related offenses, there was either an informant or an undercover agent involved in that. So critics would say, see, this is entrapment. And these poor, naive young people, they wouldn't have even gotten involved in any of this had it not been for the undercover agent suggesting these plots.
It's a very difficult situation, that because often we don't know all the details of those cases. What we often see is there is a large pool of people out there in this country who operate online sometimes who don't, who are sympathetic towards ISIS and jihadism and you know are not against the idea of attacks, but may never take part in them. But within that pool, there are people who will one day upgrade and make the next step. So the FBI has to take an assessment there and decide who are the people who they believe are going to take that next step. And if they see people in the process of doing that, they try and at least take control of that process rather than allow it to go in a way that they're not able to any longer control. So, you know, in the end, what they're doing is they're offering the outlet to people who are looking for that opportunity, and then therefore allowing themselves to control it as well as they can. Calling that entrapment, I think would not be accurate.
What's the typical prison sentence? Like if somebody gets convicted of supporting ISIS?
They vary. It really depends on specific situations. So it goes from sort of probationary issues, you know, people being put on probation, to people finding themselves being put away for life. So it kind of anywhere in between. That really depends. You know, if they were, say, offering material support, we see people getting sort of 10 to 15 years. If we're seeing people trying to actually carry out active mass murder, you'll see the sentences be much larger.
So I want to ask you about Anwar al-Awlaki. He was a Yemeni-American cleric, born in the United States, killed in 2011. What impact has he had on the global jihadist movement in the West?
So as I mentioned earlier, the problem we're facing today is kind of a culmination of over a decade of process where people like al-Awlaki took an ideology that really was kind of alien to to our country, and westernized it and gave it a Western sort of created a Western version of jihadism. So one thing is purely from the way he presented it, American accent, using sort of American slang, knowing the American culture, and really kind of applying situations that, so taking for example, the Muhammad cartoons. He would say, one of the key cornerstones of the global jihad ideology is there's a war on Islam taking place, right? And it's taking place not just, in a military sense, but in a sort of ideological, intellectual sense. And he'll say, because, your average American living in this country, particularly during al-Awlaki's time, would not have any reason to believe there was a war taking place against them. They were living happy lives with their fellow, non-Muslim citizens, their neighbors. They would have no reason to believe in this conspiracy. Al-Awlaki's job is to try and make that conspiracy a reality for them by pointing to things that they may have not otherwise noticed and saying, you see, this is proof of that war, and things like the Muhammad cartoons, things like people trying to define moderate Islam. He'll say, oh no, what they're trying to do is change Islam. They're trying to destroy Islam. So he was taking these conspiracy theories and putting them right on the doorstep of Western American Muslims. And the other big impact he had was, if you look back to when he was really popular, so from the sort of 2008 period up until his death in 2011, there was actually a period of downturn for jihadism in general, right? We had our sort of mission accomplished moment with al-Qaeda. We kind of thought maybe we were over the hump in terms of the threat. Al-Qaeda was finding diminishing returns, not managing to carry out any attacks. It was kind of, people were feeling like we were past this. And al-Awlaki, what he managed to do was kind of keep the pot boiling for the movement here, while it was harder to sort of attract people to it, and keep people reminding people that it exists and that it's succeeding here in Somalia, say, or wherever else it was at the time. And he was managing to keep it sort of on the agenda of Western Muslims at a time when the movement and al-Qaeda particularly were struggling to reach out to them, so that when another group within the movement emerged, like ISIS, they were not talking to an audience that hadn't heard this stuff before. They were talking to an audience that had been primed by people like al-Awlaki.
And he had a direct impact on some of the attacks that happened in this country. In other words, the Fort Hood shooting, the Major Hassan was in direct contact with this guy.
Yes, so Major Nid al-Hassan, who killed 13 people at Fort Hood, was inspired by al-Awlaki. Al-Awlaki, one of the other things al-Awlaki tried to do was to try and create a sort of identity crisis among Western Muslims. He would say, you see, there's a war on Islam taking place. The American military, the American citizens are voting for a president that is attacking Muslim nations, and you're sitting there and you're doing nothing.
This is back in George Bush's time.
Yeah, and he would say, you're sitting, and even during Obama's time, when with the drone, with the advent of the drone strikes, he would say, look, you guys are sitting around while your brothers and sisters are being killed. How can you sit there and watch this and be happy about it? So he was trying to create this conflict of identity and trying to make them choose one over the other. Nid al-Hassan was in an even more unique position because he was in the American military and he was a Muslim. And he was really struggling with this situation. And al-Awlaki's work helped him decide essentially what side to take. Even though the world isn't divided like this, al-Awlaki was able to present it divided like that. And in the end, Nid al-Hassan had to give in to that pressure. That identity crisis he was having, and he chose the way to express that, to kind of make up for him being part of what he saw as the conspiracy against Islam, was to fight back and to kill. And what we actually see is a lot of current ISIS supporters in this country who have acted in the name of ISIS, like the San Bernardino shooters, actually were introduced to the ideology by al-Awlaki, and they've kind of graduated from their al-Awlaki work to ISIS. And so for them,
because his sermons are still on YouTube and on the internet, and they can be found.
Yeah, you can very easily find his work. And actually, the San Bernardino couple had been looking at al-Awlaki's work, really before ISIS had become a big deal. So actually, their introduction to the ideology was through al-Awlaki. And then, by the time they started looking around for ways to act on their beliefs, it was ISIS who were the group to go to.
So even in his death, he is still impacting Western Muslims.
Yes, absolutely. I think he's still one of the most influential figures in global jihad, in Western jihadism, and many people will quote his work perhaps without even realizing they're quoting him. I mean, the thing is, his work has now kind of transcended so much that you see its influence even in people who don't realize they're being influenced by it.
He was targeted by a drone strike. He had gone to Yemen. Some people criticize President Obama for carrying out an extrajudicial assassination of an American citizen?
Well, al-Awlaki's case was unique in a number of ways. Firstly, he was in a part of the world that was very difficult to police, to take, even the Yemeni government was not able to control the area that al-Awlaki was in. This was a sort of rogue area. It would have been very difficult to request the Yemeni state to do much about his presence there. While al-Awlaki was in Yemen, we know that he was directly involved in terrorist plots against the United States, the most famous being the underwear bomber, who tried to blow up a bomb in his underwear over Detroit. And actually, we've actually found out more recently there have been other cases where al-Awlaki had a direct hand in direct terrorist plotting. So he wasn't just talking; he was directly plotting, and he was directly trying to commit or help carry out acts of mass murder against American citizens. He was in a place that made him inaccessible.
So you don't feel bad about that drone strike?
I believe that drone strike was
justified.
Largely justified. Yes.
What's happening in Minnesota? Because just the state of Minnesota has 14 ISIS-linked arrests.
Well, Minnesota has a unique situation. It has one of the bigger Somali-American communities. And a number, actually, this again sort of precedes ISIS in the sense that there were a lot of Somali-Americans who were drawn to the al-Shabaab group, which is an al-Qaeda-linked group in Somalia. And they felt they had this link to the group, this sort of ethnic link back to the group. And through a sort of buildup of again, it was sort of more physical networks in Minnesota. So groups of friends getting together, discussing the issues.
And is it happening in mosques as well in this country?
Not largely. What we find is actually most of this is now happening outside of mosques, either on the internet or in people's houses. Some of these guys might meet in mosques, they might share mosques, but they're not having those discussions in the mosques. And the mosque will not be tolerating those kind of discussions. But sometimes the original social connection may be happening either through family ties, friendship ties, community ties.
So what happens when, let's say, an American decides he's going to go fight for ISIS? He goes to Syria. If he decides to come back, is he immediately arrested?
To be honest, I don't know. I'm not 100% sure about that.
Should they be?
Absolutely. When you have an American go and join ISIS, what we know then in that case, he's very likely to receive training. And that is one of the big problems we have, because in a lot of cases, we have people who try and carry out terrorist attacks in this country who just didn't have the training to do it because they never went anywhere, so they were not very effective. If they go to ISIS territory, they will receive training from professional terrorists, and if they were to come back,
they're very valuable to ISIS because they're Americans.
They're extremely valuable to ISIS because they're Americans. We don't know the level of training they've had. We don't know why they're coming back. They may be claiming that they've turned their back on their group, and they should be given a chance to have their case heard in court about this, and everybody should have that. But we cannot give them the benefit of the doubt, of course.
Do we know how many Americans have been killed in ISIS, fighting with ISIS?
The number that we're aware of at the moment is 12, but those numbers are very hard to discern. We know of 12 Americans who've been killed in ISIS territory, yes.
On that side?
Yes, right.
Converts to Islam are overrepresented in the group of American sympathizers to ISIS. Why do you think converts are especially drawn to this ideology?
So the question of converts has been a sort of one of the big debates and controversies for quite a long time. There's a couple of different explanations for it. Sometimes we're seeing people who are not just converting to Islam and then becoming radicalized. We're seeing people converting directly to jihadism. So while they are converting to the religion to some extent, really they're converting to the ideology and the politics surrounding it, and they see, again, that's a new identity for them. So they convert directly to it. So it's kind of more people who are drawn in by the counterculture, by the sort of this kind of a popular sort of adventure feel that ideology offers them. Other converts, you have this idea of them trying to sort of prove themselves, so they kind of convert and they want to show that they.
They're really good Muslims.
Yeah, that they can get drawn in by the wrong people, and they start listening to the wrong people and say, okay, well, you want to prove yourself, you have to sort of fight for the religion. You have to do your part, and they can be manipulated in that way. But of course, we're saying the vast majority of converts to Islam in this country are peace-loving and normal Americans. But yes, we do see an overrepresentation in the sort of terrorist realm.
So most of those arrested are men. What can you tell us, though, about the American girls and women that are joining ISIS?
Yes, one of the kind of new phenomenon is that we're seeing a lot of more Western women getting involved. Look, in the end, no, we shouldn't divide it too much. In the end, you know, they're all people here, and they're being drawn in for very similar reasons. But the roles they take on are sometimes different. So the women may want to sort of go there as to support their husbands who've been radicalized, they're taking sort of, you know, in the end, we're talking about a pretty conservative traditional movement in terms of sort of the family unit. So they, you know, the wife should be there to support the husband, you know, there to sort of bring up the next generation. Because in the end, we're talking no longer just about a terrorist movement, right? These guys, they see it as a state. They've created what they see as the Caliphate in the Middle East.
And you definitely need women.
And yeah, they want to go and be part of this utopian project. They say, we want to go and we want to support this project, and not just through violence. But if we really believe this is something that's going to continue, well, we have to be part of building that society.
So there was one girl in the report. Her name is Hoda Muthana. She's 17 years old, grew up in Alabama. She goes to Syria, marries a jihadist, and then she tweets this. She says, "Veterans, Patriot, Memorial, etc. Day parades, go on drive-bys and spill all their blood, or rent a big truck and drive all over them, kill them." That was shocking to me.
Well, that's one of the roles we see women take up is sort of encouraging other people, sort of devil on the shoulder, getting online.
How did this 17-year-old that grew up in Alabama end up believing things like this and encouraging things like this?
I mean, it's happened in many different, you know, in different ways. You know, we see it happen with all different types of extreme movements. People get drawn in by sometimes people they love, and they follow them along that path. So she has, you know, again, she's adopted this new identity. She sees the world very differently than you and I do now. She may have grown up in a part of the world that you wouldn't imagine people could kind of get attracted to that ideology. But in the end, you know, these people, they get drawn in, and once they see the world differently, they see America as this enemy. They see all American citizens as fair game.
You know, Alex, I kind of go in between feeling sympathy for the parents that, you know, this has happened to them, and then feeling like, how could you have not seen this happening in your own house? I mean, people don't radicalize overnight.
No. Again, each case is different. You know, you know, we hear a lot of the time parents struggling to keep a handle on what their kids are up to, especially the way technology moves so quickly. You know, you think you understand what your kid's doing on their smartphone, on the internet, but it's sometimes it's asking a lot for a parent to completely, you know, get to grips with what their kids are up to. You know, you might want to say some parents should be perhaps more strict, should be, you know, screening what their kids are doing online, setting up all. But you know, as soon as the parent thinks they know that they've got the internet sort of locked down for their kids, you know, they don't know what the next thing is going on. You know, they've got so much on their plate that it would be harsh to blame the parents, you know, sort of across the board. But I'm sure there are cases where the parents perhaps could have watched a bit more closely. But
there's a lot of differences with American Muslims and European Muslims. In Europe, you know, they might live in ghettos. There's unemployment. There's, you know, hopelessness. That's not necessarily the case here.
No.
There's also a lot of European Muslims, or the jihadists, I should say, have gone through the criminal justice system. Petty crimes, drug-related offenses. Were any of these people in the criminal justice system?
In the United States?
In the United States.
We haven't seen that same pattern. In Europe,
why none?
Well, because again, firstly, it's taken a bit of a longer time to come over here. The prison system here is different than it is in Europe. So in Europe, you find in many of the prisons, they're allowed, you know, the jihadists who have been put in prison are not put in solitary confinement, for example. They're allowed to sort of preach and to sort of get people who are there, who are vulnerable, who are there for petty crimes, give them a new lease on life and give them a new way of understanding their identity. That's the prison system here tends to isolate the kind of people who are influential, the preachers, the jihadists. You know, you tend to get put in solitary confinement a lot more here. So they're not able to go and influence, you know, vulnerable young guys who are in there for completely different crimes.
So have we been seeing radicalization in American prisons?
That's, I think, is sort of understudied. There isn't really, I don't think, a clear answer to that. But it's certainly one of the very important areas that the government needs to make sure they are completely on top of.
Are you expecting this problem of radicalization in America to get better or worse in the next 5 years?
It's unlikely to get too much better in the next 5 years because we're dealing with a generational issue here. whether or not it gets worse will depend on a couple of things. One is how ISIS gets out of its current situation, how it reacts to probably most likely losing Mosul and next perhaps losing its capital in Raqqa. If ISIS loses control of these areas, it may turn more of its resources to terrorism rather than to state building. And if it does that, it may mean that we'll see an uptick here. But really, it's more likely we're going to see a sort of a general sort of continuing of the problem at the sort of level it is right now.
You said generational. Are we going to have to just age all these people out before we see an improvement?
To some extent, because if you see the age of people who get involved, though the age range varies, the majority are in that 18 to 25, that very sort of the age that we're all open to new ideas and kind of more willing to act on those ideas, perhaps. So yeah, in that sense, a lot of people do have to grow out of it, and we are dealing with a rebellious group of people in the end, and that is usually associated with age.
Alex, thanks so much for being on the program.
Thank you.
This has been the Mimi Geerges Show. You can see all of our programs on WHUT.org and YouTube. Connect with us on Facebook and Twitter and leave me your comments there. Thanks for watching, and I hope you'll join me again next time.